go at the end.
So everybody says it.
Anybody else? Hello. Yeah.
Amen.
All right.
Hey, we all played in the water yesterday.
Yeah. All right. So we got to here on Wednesday. So today we'll look at a little bit on sports drinks. I want to come back and do a bit more on sports drinks when we look at the next chapter as well. They are a major area of research at the moment. So there's a ton of new information in this version of the textbook on sports drinks. And they get pretty detailed, looking at some of the factors, the types of carbohydrate that can be used. So we'll come back and take another look, I think, when we do the next chapter on hydration and fluid intake. But the reason that people use carbohydrate electrolyte type drinks, so Gatorade, there's lots of different brands out on the market, is typically to provide additional carbohydrate for metabolism. And if you remember to Wednesday when we were looking at that picture of what goes on in the marathon, right, what we want to do is spare as much of our stored glycogen as possible so that we've got it there for the end of the race so that we can pick up the pace and not have to slow down because we can't metabolize fat fast enough at that intensity, right? So we can take on additional carbohydrate during the race and therefore have more left at the end of the race to maintain pace or even increase pace, right? We also need to replace electrolytes that are lost in sweat, because if our electrolyte balance isn't kind of close to what we need, then you see a drop in muscle contraction, nerve impulse transmission, and even heart rate can change because it impacts the transmission of the electrical current across the heart as well, right? So electrolytes, biggie if we're sweating a lot, and water that's lost in sweat so that we don't dehydrate, because as we see in the next chapter, dehydration leads to drops in performance in many activities. So those are typically why people are going to use them, and most of the research is looking at the use for a long endurance event. So historically, marathon, triathlon, Tour de France, those kinds of events have taken on carbohydrate drinks during the race. So you see little stations set up on the side, they veer towards the side, grab a cup. These days, they're getting even cleverer. They're making little, like, jelly cubes to try to help with the carbohydrate electrolyte. That doesn't help with the dehydration though. So you still have got to be swigging some water if you're taking the cube. Right? My brother did he's insane. He did a 10K open water swim a couple of years ago when I was home, and that was really interesting because they actually had floating like platforms out in the middle. It was on a massive Great Lake, floating platforms out in the middle of the lake with little cups of carb drinks and jelly cubes, and so they would swim over and grab a cup and try to swim and then carry on swimming. So even in those kinds of areas, they're really recognizing how important this can be to performance. How effective they're going to be depends on several factors. Gastric emptying, so how quickly is the drink moving through the stomach and into the small intestine where the carbohydrate could be digested and absorbed. So that's pretty important. If it's going to sit in the stomach and not move through to the small intestine, then that's not helpful. So the formulation becomes really key because we want to make sure that the type of carbohydrate is right, that it's going to move across and get absorbed quickly, and what's the concentration of the carbohydrate. The higher the intensity of the exercise, and or the more dehydrated you are, the slower the rate the liquid moves out of the stomach. So the key is to try to maintain your hydration at a level that improves gastric emptying, right? Because once I start to get dehydrated, then that water's not doing the job as well as it could. And what they're looking at is what they call the osmolality, which is a horrible word to say, of the fluid. It's the ratio of the solutes to the water in the drink. So the ratio, it's the number of molecules that are in the liquid, not the size of the molecules. So how many, I can use carbohydrate that has quite large molecules, or I can use carbohydrate that has small molecules. How quickly it's going to pass through doesn't depend upon the size, depends upon the number. So if you, in your book, they have this diagram a little larger, and it's really similar to that high-low idea that we had before, right? If the drink is hypotonic, so let me make sure I'm doing this around the right way, that one. So there's more fluid in the drink and less solute than there is outside the intestine, then the water moves towards the solute. So it's very similar to our high-low idea, right? If there's high solute outside the intestine, there's lower water. So the water from the, can you put that away? The water from the intestine will move out. If it's hypertonic, if I have more solute in the intestine, then I absorb water. Well, that's not great, because now I'm going to lend myself to getting more dehydrated. I'm doing the opposite job if I'm absorbing water rather than moving water into the body. So the formulation becomes really key. What you're looking for is somewhere around 6% most of the drinks on the market are somewhere around 6 to 8% of carbohydrate. If you are looking at one that's got a lot more carbohydrate, 8 to 10%, then you would use it for a different job. Right? So one of the things you've got to decide, because they're getting so clever with this stuff now, is what am I using the drink for? Am I using the drink before I run or while I'm running because I want lots of carbohydrate? Or am I using the drink after I'm running to try to rehydrate? Right? So how much carbohydrate you want in the drink is going to depend upon that question. If I want water absorption, if I want to take on water and not get dehydrated, I don't want lots of carbohydrate in the drink. I want to keep the carb level down. There are some studies that you can actually go really, really low on the carbohydrate, but most of the ones on the market are somewhere around 6 to 8%, I think. So when am I going to use it? Why am I using it? What's the amount of carbohydrate in there? A lot of them will put sodium in because they want to encourage, because it makes you feel thirsty, so you drink more. It's difficult to drink enough sometimes, and whatever works at one point in the year, you're going to have to adjust during the year anyway. Because if I'm working out in the summer when it's really, really hot, then I'm going to need a different amount of fluid than if I'm working out in the winter when it's very cool. So even if you individualize the program amongst your athletes or yourself, you've got to adapt it during the year anyway, depending upon the temperature and the humidity levels and things like that. The suggested amount is somewhere around 1 gram per kilogram per hour for a high-intensity aerobic performance. So if you're running a marathon or you're doing a bike race, 1 gram per kilogram per hour. That could be at least half a litre an hour of fluid. That's quite a lot. For some people aren't going to tolerate drinking half a litre of fluid. That's just going to be too uncomfortable. The other thing you've got to be careful of is you have to get the balance right, because you don't want to take on so much fluid that you put on weight while you're running. Right? You don't want to be half a pound heavier if you're in the race to win the race. And if you're in the race just to finish and do a marathon, that's different kettle of fish. But if you're in the race to win, you don't want to be putting on half a pound while you're running. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of information. They've got quite a lot about, do we use them during resistance training programs and when can they be useful there? And there's quite a lot of information about protein synthesis and utilizing these drinks to improve protein synthesis in a resistance program. So I want to come back and try to look at that next week in a bit more detail if we have time. Okay, so on to protein. Our ADA for our carbs was 45 to 65% of your diet. The continuum for protein is pretty large, 10 to 35% of your diet for protein. RDA for an adult, not an athlete, is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. Now, the argument is that athletes eat a lot more calories. So some people say, I don't have to change the RDA because 0.8 of 5,000 calories is a lot more than 0.8, or sorry, 10-15% of 5,000 calories is not anywhere close to 10% of 1,500 calories. But there's tons of research out there that says athletes need more protein. Particularly in a very heavy period of their training program. So when the volume is very high, protein should go up. Or if you're looking at someone who is starting a training program, protein should be higher. They find that the need for protein drops off after the first year. So the more you train, the less muscle mass you're going to gain over time. It's like once I'm here, I don't have that much further to go, right? So protein synthesis goes down a little bit, and so your protein requirement goes down according to some of the literature. Somewhere between 1 to 1.7 grams per kilogram per day, depending upon the activity, to see really improved protein synthesis. I mean, if I'm training that hard, I want to at least maintain muscle mass and maybe put on muscle mass. So I've got to provide a little bit more protein. Especially for the endurance athletes, right? Protein for the strength athletes seems pretty obvious. We forget sometimes that endurance athletes need a lot of protein because they train for so long, they do so many miles during the week that the amount of damage they do to the muscle tissue is pretty huge. So every time you train, you damage your muscles. And what we've got to do is provide the building blocks to fix the damage every day. Okay? And hope that we don't do so much damage that we're sore or we're weak or we're losing strength rather than gaining muscle mass. So if it's more than 1.7, the literature does not indicate that that's of any benefit. So the interesting thing is, if you're not an athlete, I think in our culture, people who are not athletes way overeat protein. Way more protein than they need, because they should be down around 10 to 12% of their diet is protein. Right? If I'm sedentary, I'm not moving very much, then I don't need a lot of protein to mend the damage that I'm doing by moving. So, in the West, but in America particularly, your protein portions are huge, generally. So that's part of the health question with the diet that's typical in this country. If I'm looking at, hold on, let's go here and then go back. If I'm looking at, where's that? My slide's gone. Okay, let's go back here. All right, if I'm looking at a strength athlete, then a strength athlete is probably going to want somewhere around 1.5 to 1.7 grams per kilogram per day. If I am working with an endurance athlete, somewhere around 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram per day. Right? so not quite as much as the strength athlete, but a considerable amount more than a typical person that's not trained. If you're looking at working with children or teenagers, then the numbers change a little bit because they are growing, right? If we're looking at young children, their RDA is 0.95 grams per kilogram. For teenagers, it's around 0.85, 0.9. Right? So the growth spurt, the requirement. So if you're working with teenagers who are also athletes, then they're going to need quite a lot of protein to deal with their growth spurt and trying to maybe put on muscle or at least keep the muscle they've got. Right? If I use my percentage here, then a strength athlete, a shot putter, a power lifter, maybe the defensive line in a football team, could be looking between 25 to 35% of their diet of protein. That's quite a lot of protein if you're a strength athlete. If you're an endurance athlete, you probably are okay around 15% because your calorie intake is so high and their muscle mass is a lot less than a strength athlete. But that 15%, because their calorie intake is higher, is going to provide them with a lot. Unless they're doing a very high volume, you might want to bump that up a little bit. So you've got to start playing around with these ratios quite a lot, depending upon who am I working with, what's the goal of the program. If I'm in with LV and I'm trying to gain muscle mass right now, you're looking at probably needing around 1.6 grams per kilogram per day, somewhere around 30% of your diet is protein. So where are you going to take that extra percentage from? Because remember we said we want to keep our carbs around a minimum of 50 for anyone who's training. Those of you that are training hard should be up 55, 60% carbohydrate. Now I'm looking at 30% protein with not a lot of room there for fat consumption. Right? But you don't want zero. So when we're looking at fats, we're never going to go to zero on our fat. So kind of the rage right now, high protein diets are in the news all the time at the moment. Everybody's doing them, everybody's recommending them, everybody's saying that they're a good thing and that you can lose tons of weight as soon as you eat a high protein diet, blah, blah, blah. All right? Well, part of that is going to be dependent upon A, the sort of protein that you pick, and B, if you're eating that much protein, you probably are not eating very much fat, so you probably do lose a little bit of weight because your fat intake will go down, unless you're eating all red meat. But from a clinician's point of view, from a diagnosis and a health standpoint, high protein diets have quite a lot of risk. Heart disease because of the type of protein that you might be eating. Some types of cancer are linked with high protein diets, again because of the kind of protein. If all your protein was tofu, I suspect there would not be any link to cancer. I don't know, but I suspect that if your protein source is tofu, then we don't see a lot of cancer. But that's not the typical protein source that's picked. So, adult bone loss. So you might see high protein diets can interfere with calcium and magnesium absorption into the bones. So it might encourage a loss of bone density. Kidney disease, because there's only so much protein you can process. The more protein, the higher the level of protein, to break that protein down, and the waste products that you get from breaking that protein down damage kidneys. So it used to be recommended that once you hit 2 grams per kilogram per day, you're at high risk of damaging your kidneys. I haven't seen that number recently, but kidney disease is not something to be played around with, right? And weight control, again, because of what the protein choices typically are, not necessarily the protein itself. Although if you're not training hard, remember we said calories are calories. There's a mechanism in place. You don't listen to anyone that says it's protein, you can't make it into fat. Because that's not true. The mechanism is well established in the human body that extra protein calories that are not utilized as building blocks will be turned into stored fat. So you've got to pay attention. It's okay to eat a lot of protein if you're training really, really hard and you're lifting a lot of weight and you're doing a lot of damage or you're running a lot of miles. But if you take a week off or 2 weeks off or 3 months off over the summer and you do not change your diet, you're going to come back to school heavier. You've got to use it. And we don't use protein typically as an energy source, remember. Okay. Yes, sir?
So what percentage of protein would be considered a high fat diet or a high protein diet? Anything higher than 35? Or does that be upwards of like, say, 50?
Maybe it's like when you give 1.7 grams per
Yeah. I think they would define anything, certainly anything above 40 as high. And from a damage point of view, it's different, right? When you look at high protein foods, again, the choices that we make are part of the key. Do we eat lots of fish? Do we eat lots of beef burgers, hamburgers, whatever you call them? Right? Why do you call them hamburgers and they're not made out of pigs? That makes no sense to me.
Still eating it.
And still eat it. It's true, actually. But yeah, that makes no sense to me. Often there's a lot of fat in a high protein diet. Atkins diet is a high protein, but it's also a very high fat diet. Okay? Paleo, that's one of the ones, that's one of the ones out there right now. Everyone's giving a lot of talk about, and there are good and bad things that I've seen on that diet. If you're gluten intolerant, there's some quite good things about paleo diet because they tell you shouldn't eat peanuts or wheat or peas or beans because we didn't have peanuts or peas or wheat back thousands of years, right? But there's no research on the paleo diet, and that's where I have a problem. there is research on a Mediterranean diet that doesn't cut those things out. And a Mediterranean diet is relatively low in fat and has a good choice of vegetables and different fish and cheese. And there is research that says a Mediterranean diet decreases your chance of heart disease. We don't have that research on the paleo diet yet, I suspect. I expect we will get it. My problem with the high protein kick is this sort of idea, all right? Because you guys are educated, you're going to know better, hopefully, right? But we get this, because protein's the thing everyone's pushing. Okay? And there are some very silly statements about losing weight on protein or gaining muscle mass on protein. You can't gain muscle mass by eating protein. You can only gain muscle mass by training your butt off, and the protein helps out. Right? So you've got to be really quite critical of what you're reading. But this advert is a problem to me, okay? Because what they're suggesting here, here's mum, she's got 2 kids she's trying to get to school, she's been rushing around like a crazy woman, getting their school bags packed, getting breakfast into them and getting them dressed and into the car, and she doesn't have time for breakfast, and so they say, drink a protein shake. That's their answer, right? Well, I don't agree with that statement personally, to begin with, but my real problem is this. It says, energy for every day.
Probably packed full of carbs.
Hmm?
Probably packed full of carbs.
Probably packed full of carbs, 30 grams of protein in one bottle for that little tiny woman, right? And they're trying to sell it because it will give her energy. Except we don't use protein for energy. And you're right, it probably is packed full of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, right? So it says it only has 1 gram of sugar, but what is it defining as sugar? And the point is, I cannot use protein for energy. So this is misrepresentation. I don't even know how they managed to get an advert like that published, personally, because in Europe you wouldn't be allowed to publish that because it's basically false. So that's a lot of my personal problem. And they don't educate the population about how much protein is too much protein. Right? If I have for breakfast eggs and toast, and then I have for lunch chicken and salad and rice, and then I have for dinner steak, beef burger, fish, and vegetables, and I'm not training in a weight room for 2 hours or 3 hours a day, why would I need that much protein? Plus, protein's expensive, actually, generally, depending on which source you pick. Right? Tofu's great, it's a super source of protein. If you don't like it, it's actually really good at absorbing flavors, so you can do all kinds of funny things with it. But if you have a blender, buy the really soft tofu and chuck it in a blender with bananas and kale or whatever you like to put. If you need a protein shake, why are you laughing at me? Guys, do you want to keep paying these people who are making tons and tons of money off of you because they're selling you protein drinks? Make your own. Save your money for yourself. All right? One of the other things people who actually you get this with any diet is that whatever your diet is highest in, your body will adapt to use. And there's some truth in that. But the adaptation is quite long. Takes a long time. And ultimately, you're not going to use all that protein. We're just not adapted to using protein as an energy source. You might use a little bit more. Highly trained endurance athletes use a little bit more protein when they're running than the rest of us do because of the adaptation with the training, but mostly you don't need it. You get enough protein. And if you don't, you know you don't because you're not growing or staying strong, right? If you're an athletic population, you know if you're getting weaker, you're not feeling strong, or you're deliberately trying to get bigger and that's not happening. In a typical population, if you're going to be a personal trainer or you're going to be a PE teacher, there's no reason for anyone in the typical population to be eating more than 15% of their diet as protein. All right, so, where are we? Okay. Supplementation then. If we're an athlete, when should we supplement our protein? When do we want to take that snack that has extra protein? If I've got to fill up 25–30% of my diet with protein, that's actually quite hard to eat. Because that was, if you've got a diet that is 5,000 to 6,000 calories, and 30% of those calories have to be protein, that's going to be quite hard to actually ingest in a solid form, right? So a lot of athletes use some kind of supplementation, typically a drink, but the bars are getting popular now as well. So if I'm doing resistance training, then we're assuming that if we're doing resistance training and we're taking supplementation, the goal of the training program is to increase fat-free mass. Okay. So protein mixed with some carbohydrate, you want to take either right before you start training or up to 3 hours after you finish. Right? So some right before, which goes back to the 5 o'clock in the morning training thing. Okay? The research says that if you supplement before you train, you see higher protein synthesis. Right? Well, if the goal is protein synthesis, then you should be supplementing, which means you've got to get up earlier and have a snack before you go to the gym. And somewhere within 3 hours, I believe I have read that it needs to be somewhere within 2 hours. Right? You want a combination of protein and carbohydrate to increase protein synthesis. That combination also increases glycogen synthesis, so you get a double hit. Right? Gold stars on every front, because I want to get the glycogen storage going and I want to get the muscle repair and the muscle growth going as quickly as possible. Doesn't have to be an expensive protein bar or an expensive protein drink. Peanut butter sandwich, cheese sandwich, right? Banana and peanut butter. Can be something that's much simpler. If you're an athlete and coach or whoever is providing your supplements, that's great, but they're expensive. So when you're not on a team who are providing those for you, find another way, because they're very pricey. Muscle mass still takes time. Even if you do all this right, you get all your protein supplementation right, you eat at the right times to promote synthesis as much as possible, then you're still looking at time to build muscle. You're not going to suddenly get bigger in a couple of weeks. It takes months and months of continuous training and good nutrition, and I might add lots of sleep to build muscle. Because a lot of protein synthesis goes on while you're asleep. And the rest of your body is resting, and so it can spend energy building muscle. So minimum of 6 weeks before you start to see an increase in size. Remember when we did the nervous system and we said that those immediate changes in strength, because we do see immediate change in strength when someone starts a training program. The immediate change in strength is not due to muscle mass, it's due to changes in the neuromuscular system. There's a minimum of 6 weeks to start to see growth in muscle for someone that's starting a new program. Let's see. Endurance training then, slightly different situation, because endurance training, I'm not looking to increase fat-free mass. I'm more concerned with the recovery phase, because it takes a lot of damage to train well for endurance, right? If I'm going to be an endurance trainer, I could be running 150 miles a week. A lot of miles, right? So there's a heap of damage. I need to, and if I run 15 miles today, and tomorrow I have to run another 10 miles, that recovery becomes very crucial. Otherwise, across the week, performance is going to drop off. So while resistance training, the supplementation regime here is geared towards increasing fat-free mass and recovering for the next session. Here we're mainly looking at that recovery phase. So post-exercise, again, protein and carbs, not just carbs, because the protein increases carbohydrate synthesis, muscle glycogen storage, and the carbohydrate helps the weight trainers because it increases protein synthesis. So you've got to mix. You don't want to get to the end of your training session and just eat a banana. That's not enough. Right? Make a milkshake, stick the banana in the milkshake. Chocolate milk. Anybody read the chocolate milk yet? Read the chocolate milk. It's great. Perfect. Cheap. If you can tolerate milk. And I was looking, chocolate soy milk will do the trick. Doesn't have to be milk, because not everybody is going to tolerate milk, right? It doesn't have to be chocolate, although there are more carbohydrate in the flavored versions. Okay. Mainly the chocolate is to make you drink it. Okay. It's like all the flavorings that they put in electrolyte drinks. The flavorings aren't there to do any good to your performance. The flavorings are there to make you drink the flipping thing. Because they put so many electrolytes in, if they didn't put the flavoring in, you wouldn't drink it because it would not taste good. Right? So, there's also literature that suggests that for the runners at least, if we use chocolate milk or whatever strategy we're going to take on this post-exercise supplementation, that might improve how much muscle soreness you experience. So there's some, doesn't get rid of it, like you're not going to not get sore because you get your supplementation regime right, but you might experience less soreness than you would if you weren't doing that. All right, proteins are made up of amino acids. So when we're looking at how much protein we should be eating or our protein supplement, really what we're looking at is taking in amino acids. And you want to pay attention to those that are essential. Make sure that you cover that list if you're playing with your diet that closely. Those we can't make. We have to take them in through our diet if we're going to use them. And the thing about amino acids is they don't work on their own, right? They work together in little teams to build things. So if one of the team is missing, I can't build that particular item. So my essential list, I have to make sure I'm taking in. The non-essential list, we're able to synthesize within the body given the right ingredients. So we don't have to eat these because we can make them. We do have to eat these. What else? So, homemade protein shakes. Peanut butter sandwiches, big proponent, peanut butter sandwiches. Make sure that it's on good bread, because we had that conversation about